The uniform was different, the environment was controlled, but his mission remained the same: protect the innocent from those who would do them harm. For 12 years, that meant keeping zoo visitors safe from animal accidents and petty crime. But when armed predators of the human variety invaded his territory, the old ranger showed them what real wildlife protection looked like. Welcome to True Human Tales. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden courage and protective instincts, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. Riverside Metropolitan Zoo sprawled across 185 acres of carefully designed habitat that brought together wildlife from 6 continents in an environment that prioritized both conservation and education. The zoo had been operating for over 40 years, evolving from a simple collection of caged animals into a world-class facility that combined cutting-edge veterinary care with immersive exhibits that allowed visitors to experience the natural world without leaving the city. On any given weekend, the zoo hosted upwards of 8,000 visitors, families with young children experiencing their first close encounter with exotic animals, school groups on educational field trips, tourists adding the zoo to their metropolitan area itinerary, and serious wildlife enthusiasts who came for the conservation programs and behind-the-scenes tours. The atmosphere was consistently festive, filled with the sounds of children's laughter, animal calls, and the excited conversations of people discovering creatures they'd only seen in books or documentaries. Maintaining order and safety across such a large facility required a dedicated security team, and Frank Harrison had been the senior guard for the African Safari section for 12 years. At 68, Frank moved with the measured pace of someone who understood that wildlife required both patience and respect. His khaki security uniform always immaculate, his radio positioned precisely on his belt for instant communication with other guards and emergency services. Frank's territory encompassed the zoo's most popular exhibits: the lion pride, elephant herd, rhinoceros enclosure, and the recently opened cheetah habitat. These exhibits attracted the largest crowds and required vigilant supervision, as excited visitors sometimes forgot they were observing apex predators capable of serious harm if security protocols were compromised. His daily routine began each morning at 6 a.m. with a complete inspection of all barriers, gates, and emergency equipment in his section. Frank checked every fence for signs of wear, tested all locks and latches, and verified that emergency response equipment was positioned correctly and functional. His attention to detail was legendary among zoo staff. Frank could spot a loose bolt or worn cable from distances that impressed even the maintenance crews responsible for repairs. What made Frank exceptional wasn't just his mechanical knowledge or safety consciousness, though both were considerable, but his ability to read both animals and people with equal skill. He could recognize when an animal was displaying stress behaviors that might affect visitor safety, and he could spot human visitors who were becoming overly excited or taking risks that could lead to dangerous situations. Children were naturally drawn to Frank's calm presence and extensive knowledge of animal behavior. He knew the name and personality of every animal in his section, could answer detailed questions about feeding schedules and habitat requirements, and had an unlimited supply of fascinating facts that made educational visits memorable for young minds. Parents appreciated how Frank could redirect excited children away from potentially unsafe behavior while maintaining the magic and wonder that made zoo visits special. Regular visitors had developed genuine relationships with Frank over the years, particularly members and annual pass holders who visited frequently. The Martinez family, who brought their 3 children monthly, always sought Frank for updates on new births or animal interactions. Elderly visitors appreciated Frank's patience in helping them navigate challenging terrain and his willingness to share optimal viewing times. Frank's incident reports were models of thoroughness and professionalism, documenting everything from minor injuries requiring first aid to potential security threats that warranted police attention. His radio communications were crisp and efficient, providing other guards and management with exactly the information needed without unnecessary chatter that could interfere with emergency coordination. What visitors and most zoo staff didn't know was that Frank's exceptional animal behavior knowledge and threat assessment skills had been developed in environments far more challenging than carefully controlled zoo exhibits. His ability to track movement patterns, anticipate dangerous situations, and coordinate rapid response protocols came from 25 years with the National Park Service, where he'd specialized in wildlife protection and law enforcement in some of America's most remote and dangerous wilderness areas. Park Ranger. Frank Harrison had served from 1975 to 2000, working everything from Yellowstone's grizzly bear management to anti-poaching operations in Alaska's vast national preserves. His official Park Service record listed his specialty as wildlife protection and law enforcement, but the classified portions revealed a career spent protecting endangered species from criminal organizations that operated with military-style equipment and tactics. Frank had been part of the teams that developed modern anti-poaching protocols for federal land management, working undercover to infiltrate trafficking networks that moved everything from rhino horn to exotic birds through international black markets. He'd coordinated operations that required tracking armed criminals through terrain where a wrong step could mean death, and his expertise in reading animal behavior had often provided the intelligence that led to successful prosecutions of wildlife crimes. His transition to civilian life had been carefully planned by Park Service supervisors who understood that rangers with his experience needed to stay connected to wildlife protection work. The zoo security position wasn't random, it was therapeutic, allowing Frank to use his skills for education and conservation rather than law enforcement, for helping families appreciate wildlife rather than pursuing those who would destroy it for profit. The zoo's head of security knew Frank was former Park Service, but had no idea of the scope of his federal law enforcement experience. His job application listed his background as Federal Wildlife Management Security Operations, which seemed perfectly suited for a security position that required understanding both animal behavior and crowd management. The weapon he was licensed to carry was assumed to be standard protection for senior security personnel working in facilities with potentially dangerous animals. What they didn't know was that Frank's security office held more than standard zoo equipment. The locked cabinet contained detailed profiles of wildlife trafficking networks active in the metropolitan area, information he'd compiled by cross-referencing visitor patterns with federal databases. His radio could monitor law enforcement frequencies, and his office included backup protocols for coordinating with federal agents. 12 years, Frank had found deep satisfaction in his zoo work. Helping families appreciate wildlife had gradually replaced the stress of pursuing those who exploited it, and the steady rhythm of zoo operations had allowed him to heal from years of confronting humanity's worst impulses toward the natural world. His greatest joy came from watching children develop genuine love and respect for animals, knowing that each young conservationist represented hope for the future of wildlife protection. Saturday, September 14th, was a perfect autumn day for zoo visits. Comfortable temperatures, clear skies, and the kind of crisp air that brought out families eager to enjoy outdoor activities before winter weather arrived. The zoo was operating at near capacity with over 7,500 visitors spread across the facility, creating the lively atmosphere that made weekend shifts both challenging and rewarding for security staff. Frank had completed his morning inspections and was beginning his first patrol circuit when he noticed them. 4 men moving through the African safari section with the purposeful navigation that Frank's trained eye recognized as operational rather than recreational. They wore casual clothing that was slightly too coordinated, carried backpacks that appeared heavier than typical tourist gear, and communicated through subtle hand signals that most people wouldn't recognize, but that Frank's law enforcement training had taught him to read as tactical coordination. Frank's threat assessment protocols, dormant for years but never fully disabled, began processing danger indicators with automatic precision. The men's movement patterns were wrong. They were studying security positions and emergency exits rather than observing animals. Their attention was focused on infrastructure and crowd control points rather than wildlife exhibits, and they were photographing areas that had no educational or entertainment value for legitimate visitors. Frank continued his normal security patrol without changing his demeanor or routine, but his awareness shifted into the heightened state that had once made him invaluable to anti-poaching operations in remote wilderness areas. He mentally mapped the zoo's layout, noting visitor concentration areas, emergency evacuation routes, and communication dead zones. His hand moved casually toward his radio while his mind calculated response times and coordination requirements. The men positioned themselves strategically around the main visitor pathways, where families with young children were enjoying close encounters with elephants, lions, and other crowd-favorite animals. Their placement suggested they were preparing to control movement rather than simply observe the weekend crowd, and their synchronized timing indicated coordination with additional personnel positioned elsewhere in the facility. At 1:47 p.m., during the peak visitor period when lunch crowds and afternoon tour groups created maximum population density, Frank's suspicions were confirmed when zoo-wide radio chatter reported suspicious activity in 3 other sections. Security guards across the facility were observing similar groups of coordinated individuals conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance of high-traffic areas, emergency systems, and security protocols. Frank realized he was witnessing the preparation phase of what law enforcement professionals called a soft-target mass casualty event, an attack designed to maximize civilian casualties in a location where families felt safe and security was designed to be helpful rather than defensive. The zoo was perfect for such an operation. Thousands of concentrated targets, including children, limited escape routes through terrain that favored defenders, and security protocols designed for lost toddlers rather than armed assault teams. As Frank coordinated with other security personnel through encrypted channels, he observed the first man produce what appeared to be a compact submachine gun from his backpack, with movements that suggested extensive training and preparation. The weapon's appearance in a family environment filled with children triggered Frank's protective instincts with an intensity that transcended his years of peaceful zoo work. That's when Frank stopped being a security guard and became a park ranger again. Frank's response combined the wildlife protection instincts he'd developed over 25 years with the tactical training that had kept him alive during anti-poaching operations in environments where criminals operated with military-grade equipment. His first priority was civilian protection, using his radio to coordinate immediate evacuation of families from the immediate danger zone, while simultaneously alerting law enforcement units positioned around major metropolitan facilities. The zoo's emergency protocols, which Frank had helped develop based on his federal experience, activated with precision that reflected years of planning for scenarios that everyone hoped would never occur. Visitors were guided to predetermined safe areas using routes that Frank had mapped during his first year, taking advantage of natural barriers and exhibit structures that provided protection while maintaining clear evacuation pathways. Frank's service weapon, a Sig Sauer P229 that had been his sidearm throughout his Park Service career, came from the locked cabinet in his security office with the familiar weight of a tool he'd hoped never to need again. His position in the African safari section provided excellent overwatch of the main visitor pathways, and his 12 years of daily observation had given him intimate knowledge of every sight line, cover position, and tactical advantage in the immediate area. The armed men had expected to encounter defenseless families whose panic would provide easy targets for maximum casualty operations. What they encountered instead was return fire delivered with the precision of someone who'd spent decades protecting innocent life from armed predators, whether those predators walked on 2 legs or 4. Frank's tactical experience allowed him to coordinate with responding law enforcement while maintaining defensive positions that protected evacuating families. His knowledge of the zoo's layout and animal behavior patterns enabled him to guide police response through routes that avoided both civilian concentrations and potentially dangerous animal enclosures that could be compromised during the conflict. The radio system designed to coordinate routine zoo operations became the lifeline that managed emergency response, with Frank's voice providing real-time intelligence about suspect positions, weapons capabilities, and civilian evacuation status. His federal training in crisis communication ensured that responding units received accurate information without the confusion that could turn a contained situation into a broader tragedy. Within 18 minutes, the threat was neutralized, the zoo was secure, and the 7,500 visitors who had come to appreciate wildlife were safe from predators they'd never expected to encounter. Frank's immediate threat recognition and tactical response had prevented what could have become one of the deadliest attacks on a family-oriented facility in American history. The evacuation procedures that Frank had helped design proved their effectiveness as families were guided to safety with minimal panic and no civilian casualties. Parents later described how zoo security personnel had remained calm and professional throughout the crisis, helping children understand that they were playing a special safety game rather than fleeing from danger that could have traumatized young minds permanently. The investigation revealed the full scope of the planned attack, a coordinated assault designed to target multiple family-oriented facilities across the metropolitan area simultaneously, creating maximum psychological impact through attacks on locations where children and families gathered. The terrorists had researched zoo operations, security protocols, and visitor patterns with the thoroughness of professionals planning military operations. What they hadn't researched was Frank Harrison. The FBI agents who debriefed Frank were familiar with his federal service record and understood immediately why the attack had failed so completely. 25 years of wildlife protection operations, expertise in anti-poaching tactics that required tracking armed criminals through challenging terrain, the kind of protective instincts that made conservation officers willing to risk their lives for creatures that couldn't protect themselves. The media wanted to interview him about his transition from federal service to zoo security, about the psychology of wildlife protection work, about the moment when his two careers had intersected to protect human families the same way he'd once protected endangered species. Frank politely declined all interview requests, preferring to let the animals he protected continue to educate visitors about the natural world rather than focusing attention on the violence that had threatened to destroy that peaceful mission. Riverside Metropolitan Zoo reopened 3 days later with enhanced security protocols and a new understanding of the man who patrolled the African safari section. Frank returned to his rounds with the same quiet professionalism he'd always shown, helping families appreciate wildlife with the same patient dedication that had made him a favorite among regular visitors. The only visible change was a small plaque near the main entrance dedicated to all those who protect the innocent, both human and animal. Frank had requested that it not mention his name or the specific incident, preferring to be remembered for the thousands of positive educational experiences he'd helped facilitate, rather than the one day when his other skills had been needed. Because some people spend their entire careers protecting life in all its forms, and when they transition from one environment to another, their mission remains fundamentally the same. Frank had spent 25 years protecting wildlife from those who would destroy it for profit, and 12 years helping families develop the appreciation and respect that would protect wildlife for future generations. The uniform was different, but the calling was identical. Stand between the innocent and those who would harm them, whether the threat came from poachers in remote wilderness or terrorists in peaceful family spaces. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like Frank? Someone who seemed like just a friendly zoo security guard until the moment they revealed the depths of their expertise and dedication? Someone whose daily presence made you feel safer without knowing why? Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today, and share their story with us. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us make sure they are. We publish human stories that matter every single week. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, sometimes the person protecting your family day out knows more about real protection than you could ever imagine.